Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news regarding both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. CES for Sony was highly anticipated. Many expected us to get some key details regarding the PlayStation 5, and well, we got the logo. And I'm sure you'll agree, no one expected the logo to look almost identical to the PlayStation 4 logo. Furthermore, we also saw Sony release a slide which doubled down on certain claims, such as hardware ray tracing. Honestly, there's not an awful lot to cover for Sony's CES 2020 event in regards to the PlayStation 5, so instead I will be touching on some information that I got sent yesterday. Now, I was going to cover it yesterday, but I decided to wait until today, simply because I thought, well, there's always a possibility that Sony could provide some tantalizing details of the PlayStation 5, So, yeah, this is basically what I was going to be covering yesterday for the most part. So, yesterday I received an anonymous email which linked to Pastebin. In the end, anyone can make up anything and throw it on Pastebin, so going into this with a massive truckload of salt is the best option. And there are a couple of things which did make me raise my eyebrow, not least of all claims that using the second generation of RDNA, which does seem contrary to what we've learnt so far given other leaks and official documentation. So the testing information that I've received points to a Navi 10 Lite based GPU, but A, the documentation is incomplete, and B, it is potentially possible that Navi 10 Lite does have some elements of the second generation. One potential reason to say that that's possible is Bits and Chips did DM me on Twitter, and he does generally have pretty good insight into what's going on in companies. You should give him a follow. And he did tell me that he believes the PlayStation 5 is using a hybrid RDNA approach, so it has some elements of the second generation of RDNA, although it's mostly built around the first generation, so potentially that could be one explanation regarding the claims by this leaker. But anyway, let's go into the specifications themselves. Okay, so let's go through this very methodically, but we'll start from the very first sentence and the very last sentence, and you'll see why in a moment. PlayStation 5 latest proposed core specifications 06/01/2020, which is saying the 6th of January, which means it popped up yesterday, and that's actually the date that this was put on Pastebin. It says it's for the base model, not the PlayStation 5 Pro. Sony themselves have teased that the PlayStation 5 Pro is incoming. Frankly, given what happened with the previous generation for both companies, I think that's a good chance. Anyway, then switching to the bottom line, launching November 20th, 2020 at $400. Honestly, that price makes sense to me, no issues there at all. Has a controller, also makes sense, and also a first-party game. I'd be shocked, honestly, if that was a physical release. I suspect it's much more likely that it's a digital code. No issues with that. And, of course, they've also said that there will be game bundles available as well. That kind of makes sense and probably going to be retailer dependent and region dependent. What I've noticed, though, about the date situation, November 20th, 2020, and then at the very first line it says 06/01. So the first line is using UK date, the second line is, the last line is using US date. This potentially means that someone has copied and pasted something, or it means that someone is like me and they are used to working in US regions. I actually tend to do that a lot. When I write file names, for example, when I'm recording, very frequently I will use US date because I will then be sending stuff, or if I'm emailing people, I tend to use US date a lot because I'm dealing with people in the States. But then my brain will sometimes do a switcheroo. I'm not saying that that's what happened, and once again, this stuff could be complete and utter rubbish. I will also point out that these specifications are rather close to what we saw from an alleged development kit, which was doing the rounds a few days ago. I did cover it. The development kit did have a slightly slower CPU. It still had 3200 MHz, which is the same clock frequency that we've seen from multiple leaks now. And the GPU was running at 2060 MHz, still with 40 compute units though, so 60 MHz higher on the GPU, And the bandwidth is also higher, 576 gigabytes per second, which would mean if it's a 256-bit bus, 18 Gbps modules, which would be extremely fast. Interestingly though, both of these are stating to be 40 compute units, whereas all the internal documentation I've seen, it's 36 compute units which are active. The full Nave 10 die only has 40 compute units, so given yields, you would think that at least a few of these would want to be disabled, which means that potentially either A, Sony are going hell for leather and just having every single compute unit they can enable, which would mean that they would have very little margin for error. If one of the CUs was damaged during manufacturing, they would have to throw out the entire die. Or B, these new specs would be for a development kit, which would still mean that 36 CU would be active on the retail console. And I guess there's also a C, that these specifications are completely and utterly rubbish. Anyway, switching to this APU side of things, this is the juicy stuff. Zen 2 Custom 7nm CPU, 8 cores, 16 threads, 3.5 GHz. A few things to take away. One, the clock frequency has been increased by 300 MHz. That, honestly, I think makes sense. It's not unreasonable, and this is the same clock frequency that I believe the Xbox is running at as well. I think for them to have parity with the Xbox in clock frequency, I could see that. It also, though, potentially means that someone's just been like, well, we don't want the Xbox to have an advantage in CPU, so we're just going to write the same clock frequency. But then again, 3.5 GHz, I think could be accurate, given that they're stated, at least how I'm reading this, that this is very close to final production silicon. And this being final production silicon, or at least close to it, also makes some level of sense, given the APUs that we're seeing for the next generation Xbox, which Phil Spencer has been showing off, but we'll get to that when we get to the Xbox section. Anyway, 8 cores, 16 threads, no problem with that. Sony themselves have confirmed it for A. For B, there's been like 2 billion leaks of that. Zen 2, also 1 billion confirmations that that's true. Semi-custom has not been confirmed, but I can tell you that Bits and Chips, who is usually pretty accurate with AMD stuff, did tell me that it's Zen 2 Plus, I believe was the term he used. He basically said to me and DMs that it's not Zen 3. Instead, there's just some customizations, lower power consumption, and maybe a few instructions built onto the CPU. He said it might be similar to the Xbox as well, but he doesn't have all the details. He said there's also some cache changes as well, which also makes sense to me. I think one of the ways they're probably going to customize it is by shrinking the size down by simply snipping the level 3 cache. That's my own personal assessment based upon the fact that the level 3 cache just eats up so much space. I've discussed that ad nauseum several times before, but basically 50% of the 8 cores in terms of the space of the 74mm square is pretty much level 3 cache. Anyways, switching to the GPU, RDNA 2 semi-custom 7nm GPU with 40 compute units at 2 GHz, up to 10.25 teraflops. That's many teraflops. Double rate FP16, variable rate shading, integrated geometry culling via the GPU. I'm going to pause it right there, won't go any further, and let's analyse that. So it's a few things. 1. Double rate FP16, I like that. A lot of people forget that this is now part of RDNA. It was first introduced in the Vega architecture, and Sony then implemented it into the PlayStation 4 Pro. It's basically, you might also know it as rapid packed math. Essentially what it does is that if you're running half precision floating point operations, FP16, you can run 2 of them simultaneously on the same shader. So basically, to simplify that, it means that you could do a lot more work on the GPU. To clarify, this is part of the RDNA specification. The reason I like it is a couple of reasons. 1, most people have forgot it exists, to be totally honest. And 2, it would be of critical importance for them to include this on the GPU for PlayStation 4 Pro backwards compatibility. Secondly, variable rate shading. That also, I've seen patents for Sony actually patenting a technique which is basically variable rate shading. It's not called exactly that. Sony have not called it variable rate shading, but the long and the short of it is basically variable rate shading. This was a patent that we saw which was filed on the 13th of September, and its elegant name is Varying Effective Resolution by Screen Location by Altering Rasterization Parameters. There are a bunch of these different patents which Sony have been filing over the last several months / even years, and I suspect there's a number of them that haven't been made publicly available yet. And there's also some of these which do pertain to virtual reality. I'm not going to go super in depth into what this actually is, variable rate shading, but all you need to know is that the level of detail of an object essentially differs based upon the proximity to the camera. So in other words, if an object is really far away or partially obscured, the geometry, for example, can be created in a much lower quality. So you would have fewer triangles. NVIDIA, that's the word I was looking for. It was a very complicated word I was looking for there. But NVIDIA basically did very similar with Turing. Microsoft have also a whole crap ton of patents for variable rate shading because it's part of the DirectX standard as well. And honestly, this just is pretty obvious it's going to be for the PlayStation 5. So then, what issues do I have with this? Well, let's start things out with the number of compute units. As far as I understand, there are 40 compute units on the PlayStation 5 die. And here it's stating that all of them are active. Now, it's potentially possible that this could be for a development kit, but basically it's stating all 40 are active and they're running at 2 GHz. That's a lot of power consumption. There's actually a really fascinating article from Igor's lab, I believe it was, where he really kind of looks at the power consumption of the RDNA architecture. And basically, as you start cranking up the clock frequency, RDNA starts pulling energy really fast. And it's potentially one of the reasons that the Xbox may not be crazy in terms of power consumption compared to the PlayStation 5. Because while it does have more compute units, you do have a considerably lower clock speed. The other thing as well is that, technically speaking, if you do the math, 2000 times 40 times 64 times 2, it means you get 10.24 teraflops, so it's actually slightly out. Although there's potentially a remainder on the CPU clock, and they've basically just rounded it down to 2 GHz. None of that, to me, is as off-putting though as RDNA 2, semi-custom 7nm. So all of the information we have thus far is that the PlayStation 5 is using the first generation of RDNA. Indeed, the internal testing documents that I've got, plus a few other documents, is that it's Nave 10 Lite. Even Tim Apisak, with all of his testing, Komachi with his discoveries, and so on and so on, it all points to an RDNA 1 based solution, Nave 10 Lite. In other words, a derivative of the same technology which is found in the RX 5700 series. Potentially, it could be that the PlayStation 5 does have some level of customization on the GPU. Don't forget that these tests are a little bit old. Some of the information dates back about 6 months, and so therefore it's possible that some elements of the GPU were not active on earlier engineering sample, or it's possible that the tests were just incomplete. And adding to that, I will say, once again, I'm citing Bits and Chips, he told me he believes that it's a hybrid design. It does have some elements of RDNA 2, but it's not fully RDNA 2. He believes it's base RDNA 1 with some elements of RDNA 2. That would be a bit like the PlayStation 4 Pro. That's not my information. All the information I have tells us that it's the first generation of RDNA, Nave 10 Lite, although there is some confusion exactly what that is. So that to me is kind of a red flag. That's the biggest red flag out of all of this stuff. It would also make me wonder why there's not hardware ray tracing on board, but maybe that's the reason. Maybe Sony have said, you know what, we're not going with hardware ray tracing, we want our own custom solution. Instead, we want this, this and this from RDNA 2, the rest of it we don't really care about, because we want our own dedicated hardware ray tracing accelerator. It's contained in the APU die. It's for shadows, reflections, global illumination, particles, and it will also make you a coffee in the morning. So this basically means it's not a separate chip, if this is true. It is literally contained on the APU. There were some reports that this is the case. Now, whether this individual has simply taken those reports and then plonked that onto this, or whether this is true information, I don't know. I would love to know exactly the capabilities of the hardware ray tracing accelerator and what exactly it does differently compared to the second generation of RDNA. RDNA is using a hybrid design. Is there a reason Sony didn't do that? Maybe they didn't feel it was going to be good enough. Maybe they feel that the second generation of RDNA was running a little bit behind schedule. Is it potentially possible that the ray tracing accelerator does other stuff, and that's why Sony needed it? Or is it to do with backwards/forwards compatibility? That's another reason I think that Sony has a heavily customized design. I also think that Microsoft have customized their GPU quite a bit as well. And I've also seen similar documentation that the Xbox Series X handles backwards compatibility by downclocking its GPU, and basically backwards compatibility very similar. Switching to the memory, they state that there's 16GB of GDDR6 memory with an additional 4GB of DDR4. The DDR4 is linked to the RISC storage processor, I'll get to that in a moment, but the GDDR6 memory has 512GB per second of bandwidth on a 256-bit bus. This means that you have 16 Gbps modules, which is well within the margins of potential possibilities. I believe that that's accurate. Some of the documentation I have says that it's 448GB per second. However, in that same documentation there is several mentions of 512. From what I can ascertain, those tests seem to be later. So potentially Sony were like, yeah, that's not enough bandwidth, we need to kick it up a notch. So maybe they basically used their Spice Weasel on it. Thumbs up if you get that reference. I'm hearing that 16GB of memory is split between the OS and games, but here it seems to imply it's not. That there is 4GB of DDR4 purely for system. And this is also linked to the RISC storage processor. There are multiple reports that this is the setup of the PlayStation 5, but there is some confusion on how it works. I've heard a couple of different theories. One, the DDR4 memory is for OS, and also as kind of a cache for the NVMe drive. Or two, it is literally only for the NVMe drive. And the operating system takes a chunk of the GDDR6 memory. So this would act as kind of like a cache, the DDR4 I mean, for data which is being pulled off the NVMe drive. Speaking of which, let's move on to storage. 1TB of space on a semi-custom NVMe drive, and this is accompanied by a 1TB 7200 RPM drive. They are, quote, managed together by the RISC storage processor. I would love to know how this works. As I said a moment ago, this basically means that the 4GB of memory potentially acts as a cache, or at least some of that acts as a cache, because obviously RAM is still faster than any NVMe storage at the moment. Secondly, it would mean that the two drives, the HDD and the SSD, work together in tandem. I don't actually have any information on how that would work. I can make a couple of guesses. For example, you could have data with games which you don't really play that much kept on the hard drive, and more frequently played titles would be on the SSD. And potentially as well, let's say you were playing a game that was single player. That's a nice easy one. And you're playing a campaign, let's say that it's got 5 chapters in it. So chapter 1 would be what would be loaded, and you'd be playing chapter 1, but chapter 2 would also be stored. You complete chapter 1, and then the data for chapter 2 would be loaded. The data for chapter 1 would be deleted, and then it would start transferring the data from chapter 3 to the NVMe drive. That makes sense to me, and yeah, it would also mean the hard drive would be relatively easy to upgrade, because I suspect that the NVMe drive won't be easy to upgrade. I expect it's going to be soldered directly to the board. So, how accurate do I think this stuff is? Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it's quite close to the final specifications, particularly when it comes to the CPU side of the equation. It would be one of the easiest elements for Sony to bump up in terms of performance. And let's face it, the CPU is going to be of critical importance for the next generation of games. Not only does it do little unimportant things like issue instructions to the GPU, which don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Sorry, I'm just in a sarcastic mood today, I don't know why. But furthermore, it does actually other very mission-critical tasks like drive AI, which is obviously going to be a huge focus on the next generation. Plus, given that the SSDs inside the next generation of consoles are going to be so fast, I imagine that just being able to keep up with the ridiculous rate of streaming data, and then being able to keep up with higher frame rates in games, particularly with open world, where you can have so much more in the environment, like destructible physics, just a lot more objects on screen, and just overall more stuff in a more immersive world. It's all going to be fascinating, though, to see what the next generation of games looks like. Now, let's move over to the Xbox, because while Microsoft didn't exactly have a thrilling presence at CES 2020 for the Xbox systems, there have been a couple of very interesting developments. For one, AMD kind of did an oopsie, and they released a render of the next generation Xbox in their partner discussions for their various product portfolio. And so lots of people started to do in-depth analysis, like, look, you can see the amount of USB ports, and here's the power port at the back, and all this. Yeah, then they had to kind of retract that and say, yeah, we kind of just made that render up on the fly. It's not official. So, yeah, don't actually take any of this with any substance at all. It's just kind of something we made up. I really question why they did that, honestly. It kind of strikes me that they were pushing the fact that they had this close partnership with Microsoft, and then they didn't just speak to Microsoft's marketing department and say, hey, could you provide us a few renders of, like, you know, the console? Just anything would be spiffy. It's not like Microsoft are going to say no, right? They could just send it to them as like a 3D model application, or like a, you know, an After Effects project or something like that, and then AMD would be good to go. So I don't know why they didn't have better communication there. So I just want to cover that because lots of people have been DMing me and asking what I thought of the stuff that was revealed at the AMD conference. But the big discussion with Microsoft is actually the APU. As Phil Spencer did what Phil Spencer does and teases a upcoming announcement, and this is an actual profile photo he has of the next generation Xbox APU. So then, this story begins by Phil Spencer changing his avatar on Twitter to the Xbox Series X APU, which states it's Project Scorpio and is 8K capable. Interestingly then, David 8K Prian, who is the Senior Director of Hardware over at Microsoft, said that guest Phil found my missing piece, and then tweeted an image of several Xbox Series X APUs. This does tally up rather nicely because Phil Spencer himself did say that he is playing the Xbox Series X console in his home. So if you had any doubt whether that was from hardware that was basically cobbled together with a shoestring, or whether it was like a development kit, or whether this was an actual APU, I guess there's your answer. It looks like Microsoft does have pretty much complete hardware at the moment. I suspect that they're probably still tinkering around with it, maybe trying to find out what the yields are, maybe tinkering around a little bit with clock frequencies, but a lot of it is probably software optimization now. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if the dash crashes randomly, or there's, you know, issues with like loading certain games or whatever, because that's obviously part of development that this stuff happens. So Rogame on Reddit did a comparison between the next generation Xbox and the Xbox One X. Scorpio engine is 359mm squared on TSMC's 16nm process, and of course this comes up to 7 billion transistors, which is a lot. Scarlett is on the 7nm Plus processor, and even if you say that they're identical in size, you can say that there's at least 14.5 billion transistors in the next generation Xbox APU. But he tried to compare the two sizes. He basically used the surface mount caps and other similarities to try and ascertain the size. He came up to 407mm squared. What's rather interesting though is if you cast your mind back to E3 2019, in a teaser, Microsoft did show an APU. Although ascertaining solid details of the motherboard itself along with the APU was a bit difficult. There was a hefty dosage of depth of field used, and the angles were extremely sharp, meaning it was difficult to see anything much past the foreground. Either way, people did do die size estimates, because what we do know, of course, is the size of GDDR6 memory modules. A really nice estimate was achieved by Pro Elite, who is on Beyond 3D. You can see his work here. And according to his estimates, we have 384mm squared. What I decided to do is to take the APU that was shown off at E3 2019 and then compare it against the APU that Phil is showing off now. Well, it looks like the two are quite similar in terms of overall shape and potentially size. Once again, I'm not saying that the APU that we saw at E3 2019 was real. It potentially was just a placeholder, but at least it does give us even more of a reference to the size of the APU that we're seeing here. Now, I've been told several sizes. A couple of people have told me 363mm squared. A couple of people have told me 380mm squared, and honestly, it's very difficult to know exactly because, unfortunately, what we don't have is something which is a straight-on shot, which is what Phil's provided. We don't have that. It's slightly at an angle, and even if we did, it's potentially possible that the surface mount caps are slightly different in their size. I can tell you that the thing's a bloody monster. I mean, it's absolutely just a behemoth. From the documentation I've seen, there's 56 active compute units on it. That's a lot of compute units. That's a ridiculous amount of compute units, and that's why it's hitting 12 T-flops. They've basically gone a wider but slightly slower approach compared to Sony. So it's going to be fascinating to see exactly what this thing is capable of. Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you did, then of course leave a like on the video because it helps us out a ton. And also get subscribed to the channel for many more of my ramblings. I will also point out that we're on social media, so you can of course find those relevant links in the description of this video, as well as links to Amazon affiliate and so on, if you want to help support the channel. But for now, I'm going to get going, so take care of yourselves. Bye for now.